Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Edgware United Synagogue. It was back in May 2018 that I saw a fascinating article in the JC entitled "The Jews Who Helped Cure the Nazis," and I thought I'd like to know more about this topic. Fortunately, one of my contacts in Ajax knew tonight's speaker, Robert Bieber, and said he would be happy to come here. Robert Bieber received the MBE and the Queen's New Year's Honours List in 2010 for his services to the voluntary sector. He's currently a visiting research fellow in war studies at King's College London. He's a retired solicitor and magistrate, having professional interests in the fields of charity, family and mental welfare, and over many years has served Alt with distinction and dedication, having at one time been its chairman. Tonight he's going to tell us about 3 Jewish army officers who used kindness to rehabilitate their former SS enemies.
Well, thank you, Spencer. That was a very flattering introduction, and I do my very best to justify it. Anyway, it is a great pleasure to be here. I've come from Wimbledon, which is quite a trek, so I'm very glad to see that we've got quite a nice turnout. So I hope you won't be disappointed after that, as I said, that very interesting introduction. Anyway, I'm sure you come along perhaps intrigued by the title of my talk. How, indeed, could Jews make a difference to Nazis, let alone cure them? Now, I have to say my title is admittedly a little tongue in the cheek, just, as you might say, to whet your curiosity. Now, before I go any further, can everybody hear me, or is this thing all too loud? All's well. All right. Anybody not happy, put your hand up. Now, we will have a question and answer session at the end, but if anybody feels they have any burning issue they want to invite, please don't feel in any way prevented from interrupting me. Anyway, I'd like to tell you how this little story came about to be told. Because one of the ladies at our day centre in Richmond gave me a large brown envelope containing some remarkable cartoons, drawings, and other memorabilia, which had been produced at the end of the war at Featherstone Park, which was a prisoner of war camp in Haltwhistle in Northumberland. It turned out that this lady's husband had been an officer of the camp and had been given these fascinating documents by one of the inmates. So, as you might imagine, my curiosity was aroused, and I decided to research the story, and soon discovered how many prisoner of war camps there were in the UK. So now, I've got a couple of questions for you. How many prisoner of war camps do you actually think there were in the UK in 1945? Who can make a guess? Don't be shy. Any advance on 24? Keep going. Sorry, what was the last figure? There were 1,026. And I've got a list of all of them in the back if you doubt me. Now you know how many camps there were. How many German prisoners do you think were in this country in 1945? Well, round about 420,000. We don't know for absolute sure. Now, one of the things which I do in my spare time, I research at the National Archives, and I'm actually researching in the reverse way the stories of Allied prisoners held by the Germans. You'll be very surprised to know that amongst those, there are some 6,500 Palestinian Jews. I haven't actually found my way to researching all those yet, but it is going to be a very interesting story. We have found a few of them, and it seems that in the majority of cases, they were treated perfectly normally by the Nazis. They were treated as prisoners of war, except for one which I found today, who, although a Welsh Jew from Newport, and he wound up as a slave labourer for Farben in Auschwitz. Anyway, enough of that. There were PO camps actually all over the United Kingdom. There were enormous ones in the London area at Kempton Park, Wellwood Scrubs, as well as the others at Hyde Park Gardens, Harrow on the Hill, and Enfield, Stratford, East London, Cockfosters, and so on. So, as I said, those who are interested can go and have a look at the back. We'll have a table with artifacts on it, and you'll see a list of all the camps. So I was also intrigued by those numbers. So this is the story of my investigations, which took me to the Imperial War Museum, the National Archives, and the Foreign Office records, and then to Haltwhistle in Northumberland. So it's a remarkable story which I'm going to tell you, stretching from a World War I prisoner of war camp in Germany for British prisoners to guarding Rudolf Hess in Spandau in 1946. Now let me say, as every academic has to before I go any further, I have to say that I'm indebted to Mark Patton, Miriam Cochin, and Terence Pretty for their research on German and Italian POWs in Britain in the 1939 to 1948 period. The story of the Second World War sometimes throws up some really surprising stories, yet others, familiar to the 1945 generation, came to be forgotten as years went by. And so it seems to be so for a remarkable Jews and the wonder of the War Office, which in its wisdom permitted the story I'm going to tell you to happen. Now, there are a number of strands to the story. The first begins in the Kaiser's army in the First World War with a Jewish officer, Hauptmann, or Captain Herbert Sulzbach, a survivor of the Western Front, where he'd served throughout the war. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class as well as the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit, which is more or less the equivalent of a knighthood in this country. Decades later, he received the OBE from King George VI and the European Cross of Peace for his work in actively promoting reconciliation at Camp 18, Featherstone Camp in Haltwhistle, Northumberland. Now we come to another British officer, Colonel E.R. Vickers. He was captured in the First World War, too old for active service in the Second World War, and was appointed commandant at Featherstone Camp. Now, initially, I thought he was Jewish. That's why the headline from the JC actually was so expressed. It turns out he wasn't actually Jewish, but I think he had Jewish antecedents. He was certainly very, very supportive of all Jewish causes, both before the war and latterly when he was commandant in Spandau. So much for my pointer. Finally, and by no means least, we come to Captain Walter Merkel, who is actually the hero of my story and the husband I mentioned who had developed a remarkable rapport with the camp's Nazi prisoners. Now, this is my first go at seeing if I can make this thing work. Now, a little about the camp. It was solely for officers and operated between 1945 and 1949. And during that time, more than 25,000 Nazi officers were interned there. Its prisoners were classified A, B, and C according to how likely they were seen as susceptible to the denazification process. They wore coloured patches. White, meaning that the prisoner in question had no particular loyalty. Grey, indicating that the prisoner, though not an ardent Nazi, had no strong feelings either way, but a black patch signified that the wearer was a hardcore Nazi, usually meaning most Waffen SS officers, paratroopers, and U-boat crews. These, the most obdurate, the black Nazis as they were described, were given the C category, and Featherstone Camp seems to have had more than its fair share. In 1946, of the 2,759 officers in the camp, 1,027 were categorized as black Nazis. Now, in the early 1940s, Featherstone Camp was a training camp for American forces. Now, it's very isolated, and they called it Death Valley because of its isolated location. The Americans soon made way for Italian prisoners, mostly captured in North Africa, and finally for German prisoner of war officers. The camp consisted of a number of compounds, all surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, and became something of a model for its type. Now, denazification was the objective of the camp. It started as an Allied initiative at the end of the war to rid German and Austrian society, culture, press, the economy, judiciary, and politics of the National Socialist ideology. It was carried out by removing those who had been Nazi Party or SS members from positions of power and influence, and by disbanding or rendering impotent the organizations associated with Nazism. The objective was to convince the German people and its erstwhile military that they had indeed suffered total military defeat and couldn't escape responsibility for the inevitable suffering and chaos which they had brought not only on themselves, but to so much of the rest of the world. Now, as an international objective, the Western powers began to lose interest in the denazification process, mostly due to the emergence of the Cold War and the need to utilize the skills of the rocket scientists who had been the darlings of the Nazis. It was officially abolished in 1951. The American government, for their own purposes, thought that it was ineffective and counterproductive. Additionally, hardly surprising, it was unpopular in Germany and was opposed by the new German Chancellor and the government of Konrad Adenauer. Now, this was all very well, but what was to be done with the host of German prisoners in the hands of the Allies? At the end of the war, as we now know, there were some 420,000 still being held alone, and as I said, in over 1,000 prisoner of war camps. The treatment of the captives, though strict, was generally humane, and fewer prisoners died in British captivity than in other countries. The British government also introduced a program of re-education intended to demonstrate to the prisoners the evils of the Nazi regime, whilst promoting, of course, the advantages of democracy. At the outset, there were a number of prisoners who actively distrusted the program. They considered the lecturers, especially if they were obviously Jewish and/or immigrants, as traitors. But this suspicion didn't outlast the first year. Prisoners were encouraged to produce their own camp magazines, and a weekly German language newspaper, the Wochenpost, was published by the British government, specifically for the prisoners of war. Featherstone's prisoners had their own newspaper, Die Zeit am Tyne. Lectures by visiting speakers were arranged with a slant to democratic institutions. The lecturers included people like Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, author of Beginning and End of an Ideology, and Pastor Nieboller, who you will probably remember for his poem, The Question of Guilt. Costa, of course, especially known, as I said, for the poem, First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, and ending, of course, and then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me. Libraries, gramophone records, and film shows were provided. All of these activities were intended to demonstrate the principles of democracy, freedom of speech, and political and racial tolerance, as well as highlighting the economic failures of the Third Reich. Now, in August 1945, just at the end of the war, just a few months after VE Day, every prisoner of war was shown a film about the full horrors of the Holocaust, including the liberation of Belsen. Now, Hans Freiberger, a prisoner in Belfast, and at one time a real hardline Nazi, remembered that his colleagues actually didn't believe the Holocaust had taken place, and it was all propaganda designed to shame the German people even more. He described the film's effect, saying that prisoners emerged, moved, visibly shaking, and a number in tears. And so, with this introduction, if you like, we come to Featherstone Camp itself. The end of the war saw a marked change in regime. The new commandant, as I said, Colonel Vickers, had been promoted from the ranks in the First World War. And he addressed the prisoners in the following terms. Gentlemen, in the First World War, I was in a German prisoner of war camp and was treated as a gentleman. Provided you comply with the regulations, I will treat you in the same way. Now, Vickers was actually commandant only for a relatively short time. His skills in the management of prisoners were soon recognized by the authorities and resulted in his transfer to Berlin, where he became commandant, as I said, at Spandau prison, at a time when, amongst others, Rudolf Hess, Erich Reider, and Karl Dönitz were prisoners. He was assisted by the two Jewish officers I mentioned, Captain Walter Merkel and Captain Herbert Sulzbach. Now, before going further into the regime of Featherstone, I'm going to tell you a bit more about these two officers. Captain Sulzbach was born in Frankfurt and served with distinction in the First World War. He was an artilleryman, promoted from the ranks in 1916 and reached the rank of captain. He was wounded several times and was visibly affected by the death of so many of his colleagues. Amongst other decorations, he won the Iron Cross First and Second Class, as well as the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit, as I told you, more or less the equivalent of a knight today. He was a proud German who believed with absolute conviction that the Kaiser's regime was right. He was a proud Jew who never hid his background. He described his experiences with the German guns, and at the back of the hall, I've got a copy of that if anybody wants to look afterwards. And in it, he describes his revulsion at the weakness of the home front, the profiteers, and he exulted in the unbroken, pure Prussian military tradition. Now, in emphasizing the stab in the back of the military by the civilian population, he effectively prophesied the rise of the Nazi ideology. Now, if you look at this picture here, the left-hand side, here he is, a captain on the Western Front. On the right-hand side, an officer in the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers and a captain. And there, as I said, are his medals. The Iron Cross, two Iron Crosses, top and right, OBE, the Grand Cross of the Order of Pity, and so on. Now, this is Captain Walter Merkel, and he's actually very much the unsung hero of our story, as without his widow's telling me about it, you'd probably never been told and probably would have simply disappeared into the myths of history. Although he barely features in the official records, it's his relationship with the prisoners of war and what he's able to achieve that shines through. He didn't speak German, but Walter helped create an astonishing rapport with those who he guarded, as I'm going to show you. Now, Walter's was quite a mundane background. He and his twin were the fourth and fifth of 6 children, and he left school at the age of 14. They were both bright, but with little formal education, and young Walter and Wilfred were actually classic young rascals. Their mother was widowed at a very young age, and the family escaped the Depression on Tyneside for London, where the twins joined the Durham Light Infantry in the Territorial Army. Now, Walter happened to be hospitalized when his regiment was sent to Burma, from which not one of that regiment survived to return. And so that was how he came to be guarding a prisoner of war camp in Northumberland. Now, this remarkable group of officers seemed to have been allowed a surprising degree of latitude. Their way of running the camp was in marked contrast to the rather forbidding regimes practiced elsewhere. Many prisoners were bored, depressed, or truculent, and often unwilling even to emerge for morning roll call. I told you about the camp, about the facilities. Featherstone itself had a prisoners' camp with more than 5,000 books. It arranged classes with a number of cultural subjects, with the best educated amongst the prisoners being co-opted to help teach. It had a classical music group, a band, 2 playhouses, a marionette theatre, and a stage for light entertainment. Productions including Pygmalion and Hamlet. Think of all these black Nazis doing Hamlet or Pygmalion. Now, just before Christmas in 1946, the watchtowers and the barbed wire were removed, and a commandant, as I said, Colonel Vickers, gave orders that the prisoners were to be paroled, free to walk within 5 miles of the camp, so long as they returned for lights out. They were permitted to visit private homes, attend church, and accept small gifts, such as chocolate and cigarettes. They could use public transport, visit pubs, and play football against British teams. By 1947, when repatriation of those suitable for release began in earnest, it was evident to the authorities that rehabilitation had borne fruit, and that most prisoners had successfully moved from the black category to grey, and even some to white. Repatriated Featherstone officers formed their own Comrades Association, Arbitries Featherstone Park. It served as a memory platform for the returnees who had participated in the camp's re-education programs. The aim was to build on the experiences of the past, to work towards Anglo-British friendship and towards international cooperation. I found in the records of the Association of Jewish Refugees, AJR, a shining example of the enlightened attitude among British officers towards their captives. A German prisoner left an account of the behaviour of a British officer, a captain, and a Jewish refugee when an SS officer shouted "Jew lout" at him as German prisoners were being counted. Now just think for a moment what an SS officer's reaction would have been had a prisoner of war in Germany shouted SS lout at him. So what did the British officer do? He turned round coolly, replied calmly, "The Jew part is correct. The lout part is not," and carried on. The dignity of this officer's reaction to the racial stir exposed the Nazi and his crude dehumanizing ideology, not just to the public contempt, but to those in the rest of the camp, and he was shouted down. Sulzbach himself claimed in a BBC talk in 1948 that the German POWs going home will be the best envoys for peace and understanding. Now, many of the several thousand officers who passed through the camp recorded moving tributes to its achievements in re-educating them towards democracy. In 1982, they laid a plaque at the camp's site reading, "Captain Herbert Sulzbach, OBE, who dedicated himself to making this camp a seedbed of British-German cooperation." So how did the re-education process work? As I've said, lectures by visiting speakers were arranged, intending to demonstrate the principles of democracy, freedom of speech, and political and racial tolerance. And I thought, if I showed you some details from Foreign Office reports of official inspections of the camp, you get a flavour of how things fared on the ground, as you might say. Now, in Prisoners of England, published in 1980, Miriam Kokan talks about the conditions immediately before the war, and before and after Colonel Vickers' arrival. Now, see if I get this right. This is part of a booklet which he wrote. If you look at it, it was a booklet presented to the Captain Sulzbach, and it tells of the really oppressive mental boredom afflicting every one of the officers in the camp. And it goes on to say, Lieutenant Colonel Vickers, a former POW himself, persuaded a fair proportion of his officer POWs to engage in voluntary agriculture. The experience of physical work went a long way towards making captivity more tolerable, and as evidence of political progress. Amongst other things, this says, the old Nazi ideology is completely discredited in this camp. Extreme racialism has disappeared, and in its milder form, it cannot be considered purely a German or Nazi obsession. And we go on. Now, I want to apologize for these because these are copies of the copies of the official reports held at the National Archives of the minutes of the inspections at the the Foreign Office. At the time I got these, I had access to these. It wasn't possible to take official photographs. It actually is now. Anyway, to go on, this one says that Colonel Vickers has made the camp a model for fair treatment and education. It's fortunate in having Captain Sulzbach with a sound judgment on who is and who is not pro-British and pro-democratic, and morale is high. But not all reports were quite that positive. This goes on to talk about a Mr. Schepperil, not a success except with the Nazi element. In other words, he took a contrary view. His discomfiture, evidence, if you like, of his failure. He appears to have been influenced by conversations with Bethmann Hollweg. Now, Bethmann Hollweg, if you remember, was the Chancellor of Germany in the First World War. This is his grandson, who obviously has the same kind of concepts as his grandfather. Anyway, this particular version of Bethmann Hollweg was anxious to return to Faber at anybody else's expense. The lecture seems to have thrown schadenfreude over the present conditions in Germany, to the delight of the Nazis and the discomfiture of the democratic group. So this wasn't so good. Now, if I tell you that at this particular time, the prisoners of war received the same rations as British servicemen, and rather more than the civilian population, it'll give you a clue as to how the more extreme elements of the camp's prisoners came to feel superior, as indeed they did. Now we're going to revert to the more favourable. This talks about a lecturer, Dr. Bruckner, 5 years' experience in a concentration camp, and that left on him a deep impression. It goes on to say, the impartial way in which he told of his experiences, without hatred, opened the eyes of his listeners. They'd been able to believe in all that they had been told about the concentration camps. They were now convinced of the truth of what they had heard. And the last bit reads, enjoys an unparalleled degree of self-government under the imaginative and enlightened guidance of the commandant. Now, you have all got copies of these letters, or I hope as many of you have as possible. Now, for those of you who haven't, could I just ask you to take just a moment or two just reading it through? They're long, but it's quite enlightening. I think the impact of reading this yourselves is probably better than my reading it to you. It's the English doesn't follow that easily, but you can get the flavour of the impression which Kurt Schilling is making. He talks about us being a smug, well-nourished and hypocritical nation, and that others have formed an opinion. But it's very interesting, the second paragraph on page 2. I hate those people in Germany who are already again crying for help from abroad, who aim to pity the poor German campaign, as it was done after the First World War. We've lost the war, and we must bear the consequences, but we must leave it to the occupation powers, as we have no government and can't decide. And so it goes on. I think it probably puts, Kurt Schilling was one of the, he was actually one of the black Nazis. And he was one of the ones who they perceived as most difficult one to actually turn. And you can see from that letter that it's an example of how successful the camp was. And now I'm going to show you a photograph. This shows Captain Sulzbach with a group of prisoners. To the right of Captain Sulzbach, as you look at it, there is a General Heim. He was a senior German officer, and he was a former commander of the 14th Panzer Division. He was captured in Normandy. Others are Major Rosenheimer, later a general in the modern German army. There's also a U-boat lieutenant, Herbert Schmidt, who latterly became editor-in-chief of Associated Press in Frankfurt. Now, the War Office report, which I'm going to show you, there is another War Office report, and it's particularly notable, saying that General Heim is obviously convinced of the folly of militarism as well as National Socialism, and bring home to any of his fellow prisoners who hadn't already grasped it. So I think there's no better evidence of the Featherstone camp's success in rehabilitation than by showing you these letters. Now, a friend of mine, top left-hand corner, from Wimbledon, was interested in my research, and he visited Haltwhistle Library to look through the surviving artifacts of the camp. There was an exhibition in 2007 there. He discovered that the proprietor of a B&B where he had stayed had interviewed a number of former prisoners and had taken these photographs, and of the memorial plaque which I told you about before. Our two nations owe Sulzbach heartfelt thanks. His friends and members of the Featherstone Park Association are former inmates of Camp 18, 1982. And now, I think I've probably left the best things to last, as I'm going to show you some of the images that Judy Merkel, as she then was, showed me at the day centre, just in case I might have been interested. Now, there are remarkable tongue-in-the-cheek pictorial description of camp life. This is the facing page. And the one that you can see at the top is Captain Merkel with his moustache. He was a purchasing officer doing bloody business. And here he is, the fire officer. Quick, quick. And so it goes on. I mean, these are really in the sort of style of Punch cartoons. And at this time, of course, Judy Merkel was engaged to Walter. And what I'm going to show you now is a kind of congratulatory retrospective of camp life, which we're looking at. And now, this is the wedding card written by the German prisoners involved in building the church. The staff of the German prisoners for the building in the church lines. And now a note of thanks for his support in the professional training. And last but by no means least, on the day of their leaving. And finally, the letter from General Heim, who I told you about, sums up the success of Featherstone Park in finding ways to reconcile enemies, representatives of those who committed their most unspeakable crimes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my talk. Thank you for being so attentive. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And as I said, nobody interrupted me with any questions, so this is your chance. Yes, Arlene.
Did they provide any books for the Germans to read in German?
I'm sorry, speak again.
Did they provide any books in German for the German prisoners?
Most of the prisoners obviously didn't speak any English. That was the beauty of Captain Sulzbach, because he was fluent. He spoke Italian, German, Japanese, and English. And so he could communicate with them and all the sort of Axis on the side of all the Axis participants. Yeah, Colin.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting. Did you have any information about any failures? Failures at Featherstone? Where they simply could not change the attitude of the German prisoners.
Forgive me.
Failures.
Oh, yes, of course. There's no question that they didn't all succeed. But in terms of the records as to how compared to any other prisoner of war camp. They were far more successful, and that's why they fed the ardent Nazis through to that camp. But clearly, there were some who wouldn't succeed, and there's also those who would have given the impression of being turned and probably wouldn't have done. So, but they were more successful than anybody else.
When people were allowed to go and do the agriculture and whatever,
Yep.
did anybody try and run away?
No, they didn't. That was one of the reasons why the Americans called it. Why they. I can't remember what they called it, but you remember earlier on in my speech they said it was very isolated. I mean, clearly they could have done, but the Italians were first of all who were there were perfectly happy to be there and had no intention of going back to Italy to fight. By 1945-46, Germany had lost the war, so there was no real benefit to going back. Germany was on its knees. There was starvation throughout so much of Germany. They were far better off actually in the camp, better fed. They did, and to that extent, they were enthusiastic to go back. But had they, I mean, if you have to consider, they weren't in the camp for years. The camp was open for these particular prisoners between 1945 and 49, when the denazification closed. So nobody was there for more than about a year. A few were. General Hein was there for 3 years, but more because he was such a great leader, and he was prepared. He had effectively been turned, and was happy to stay to participate in the process.
Robert, do you know anything more about Captain Salzbach? When did he come to the UK and his life after leaving the army in Germany?
He came to the UK in 1937. The fact that he was so highly decorated meant nothing to the Nazis. He was accused of having bought his decorations or having stolen them. And basically, he was likely to have been arrested. He got out in late 1937. At the time, he was on the Gestapo arrest list. When he came to England, he was acting as a translator. 1940, he was interned in the Isle of Man. He was released in 1942. He appealed to the Foreign Office. The War Office in 1944, saying that I'm multilingual, I can be of some help. He then became a private in the Pioneer Corps. At the end of the war, they realized his potential in dealing with the prisoners, and he was commissioned into the Durham Fusiliers, and he was commissioned as a captain, and he became a diplomat after the war. And he was an advocate for international cooperation. He traveled throughout Europe, throughout America, as I say, just highlighting the importance of communication, and I wouldn't say live and let live, but the fact that we had to look forward and not look back.
You said there were about 400,000 prisoners in the UK. How many of those actually settled here after the war and didn't return to Germany?
Not very many, a small proportion. Unlike the Italians, who majority actually just got on very well with the Brits and intermarried. Most of them became waiters, restaurateurs, and actually some very great. If you go up to Cumberland now, you'll see a lot of Italian names among the farming community.
And were British officers given the choice of whether they went to camps at all? And if so, did they have a choice of which one to go to?
You know, that's a very interesting question. I have honestly no idea. I think that's another question for research. Clearly, the camps were principally served by older officers, because by the 1945, obviously, it didn't matter. But the majority of the internees came over after June 1944, after the D-Day landings, after the breakout into Corps and beyond. There were some 300,000 prisoners who were brought over here, At that stage, of course, all the ones who were needed were still fighting. So they were using the Dad's army, if you like, to do the guarding.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, of all the documents of all these prisoners of war that were cured of being Nazis and were, taught how bad it is to be a Nazi, are there any written documents from any of them apologizing for what happened in the Holocaust or acknowledging the actual horrors that happened of all these prisoners that were, interned?
Well, I mean, yes, the answer to that is yes, but it's not specifically part of of the research role which I've done. I know anecdotally that a number of those did. Equally so, there are a number of those who denied it. But there were far fewer who denied it after the reconciliation process than had at the outset. There are still those alternatives for Germany whose families whose supporter families are members who were former Nazis. So those are the recalcitrant ones. But I like to think that there was greater success in re-educating than those who refused to be turned.
My uncle, Walter,
Yeah.
as you say, had an identical twin brother, Wilfie.
Wilfred.
Yes, Wilfie to me.
I know him as Wilfred.
Was he involved at all at Featherstone?
He wasn't involved in Featherstone. I haven't actually researched. That's an interesting question. I don't know what he did. He was a member of the Territorial Army before the war. I've not actually gone into that one yet, but that's another thought. Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering whether these prisoners of war who were German Nazis, whether they just were not pretending that they were so pro-English because they were scared. Obviously, they were caught and they were imprisoned, and then maybe they were frightened that when they went home again, somehow, they would be in trouble if they were not pro-English afterwards. Because a lot of Nazis were not enough. Only a tiny fraction of Nazis were actually punished for what they did during the Holocaust.
I think that's a perfectly fair question, because clearly some of the prisoners would have chosen to appear to be receptive to the denazification process. And I'm quite sure some went back and had not been changed at all. But all the evidence is that the majority actually had been rehabilitated. If you, as I told you, the one of them became a general, ones you saw in the post-war German army. There are a lot of them who achieved very high positions and actually to achieve political roles in the Christian Democrat Party, the Social Democrats. So I think the answer to the question is, of course, there are some ones who chose for expediency, chose for expediency to appear to be turned, but weren't. But the majority, from all the evidence, were successfully rehabilitated. Thank you very much indeed. It's been I was going to say, it's been a pleasure. You've been a very attentive audience, and you can always tell, usually always tell, if something's gone well, because some of your questions are very, well, not some of them, your questions are very good. The worst of it sometimes, if you finish a talk like this, and there's stony silence, and nobody can think of anything, then somebody comes up with something which is completely trite. Nobody did. Thank you again.
I'd now like to call on Ron Shelley to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. It is remarkable, here we are 75 years after the end of the war, when we hear a topic which I think very few of us have appreciated before, which has been put to us in such an erudite way. And I would like to thank Robert for coming here from Wimbledon to advise us and to tell us of this subject. I've known Robert for some years. Indeed, at one time he was very active in Ajax, and I basically pleaded with him at one time for him to become the national chairman. But for personal reasons, that did not happen. One of the difficulties for me with this topic this evening, and which was referred to by two of the questioners, was I wondered what the reaction of you mentioned the fact that the commandant, Vickers, I think, had been a prisoner of war in World War I and treated fairly, and therefore decided that he would treat all his prisoners fairly, even the black Nazis. I had some difficulty with that because we weren't treating like with like. Here you had, to me, these black Nazis, I would have wondered what they got up to during the war. These die-hard German Nazis who had fought for Germany in a vicious way. You talked about the U-boats, you talked about the paratroopers, you talked about the Gestapo, or not so much the Gestapo, but you talked the SS officers and so forth. And these were died in the war, and there you have 3 Jewish officers who have been told they've got to treat them very benignly and very positively. And I just have some difficulty how they managed to achieve that in so forth. Nevertheless, it has been a very interesting evening. It reminded me of one prisoner of war, all of you may have remembered, Bert Trautmann, who played for Manchester City as a goalkeeper for many years and who rehabilitated himself and married a British girl. It took some years for the British public to get used to the idea, but eventually he was accepted as a decent guy. I don't suppose he was there either, not to your knowledge. Well, can I say to you, Robert, once again, on behalf of all of us here, thank you for coming. Thank you for telling us of a topic that we had not previously been aware of, and for your erudite and educational way you've presented it. We're all much obliged to you. And not to drink on the way home, Robert, because we would not like to feel that as a result of your success here this evening, that you deserve a tipple. You certainly deserve it, but not before you get home.
Just a comment about one point that we just made. It was the officers themselves who chose to take this particular view. This is the uniqueness of this particular camp, because the other camps were much more doctrinaire. Vickers, for his own motives, I mean, you're absolutely right about how could he possibly have taken such a benign view with such potentially horrendous, but he chose to do it, and the evidence is that his camp was more successful than anybody else's. It is a bit of a mystery. The only thing I wanted last to say to you, a lot of the things which I've shown you, the pictures and the cartoons and so on, the originals are on the back of the table if you'd like to go and look at them. So thank you all once again, and thank you very much for my whiskey. I should drink you out in good time.